So, good afternoon, everyone. This afternoon, Leslie and I are going to introduce a couple of famous American railroads to you. But I think you'll see as we present that these railroads are quite different, and yet they're both extremely important in American history. Leslie?
Thank you, Ken. Okay, today my presentation is about the Underground Railroad. And the Underground Railroad is something that occurred in the United States prior to the Civil War. What interests me so much about the Underground Railroad is this is a period of time that I'm fascinated with the Civil War, the War of 1812, the region of the United States, but also the humanity, how people are the ones that affect change with history. People are directly affected by it, and they create change. This is a picture of Harriet Tubman. She was a famous abolitionist. Do you remember abolitionist?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. So she was an escaped slave. She escaped from Maryland, the Chesapeake Bay region. She was very active, and this is a saying that's associated with her. Even though we don't have any physical evidence in her memoirs saying she said this, through oral tradition and oral history, this saying is associated with her. And she says, "Children, if you are tired, keep going. If you are hungry, keep going. If you want to taste your freedom, keep going." And in 13 trips that she made between her new home and down into the South to rescue her family, she saved about 70 people, family members and close friends. So the presentation really is like an extended definition presentation where we're going to define the Underground Railroad, explain some of the terms, but the impact, how the Underground Railroad and the reactions to the Underground Railroad, the results of the Underground Railroad still affect society and laws today. They affect the United States laws, but also international laws. This is an example of a flyer for a woman named Emily. She was a runaway slave, and she tried to escape for her freedom. We don't know what happened to Emily, but this was posted in Boston, and the person, her former owner, said there was $100 reward for anybody who could capture her. Now, the Underground Railroad itself was not a railroad. The Underground Railroad itself was not a railroad. The Underground Railroad is actually metaphoric. It was an organized structure for people who helped men, women, and children escape their slavery into a new area. And we called that the path to freedom. It was called underground because people who helped the slaves escape actually were breaking federal law, and in some places they were breaking state law, so they had to be hidden. Just as with the railroad, people who led the escape to freedom were called the conductors, just like the person who drives the train. I don't really know how they drive a train. You have pilots drive airplanes, conductors have the trains, and the conductors were the people who organized the trips for freedom, and they literally went with the people, with the slaves they were helping to escape. Frederick Douglass is a very well-known abolitionist. He is a conductor, and he was a former slave. Last week, somebody asked a really good question. Somebody gave a presentation. Somebody asked an excellent question. Her timing was a little bit off, but she asked, did Frederick Douglass and Dr. King know each other? The timing was off by about 100 years, but the influence was dramatic. Frederick Douglass escaped through Baltimore, went to England, and he started giving lectures and writing papers. And people started seeing him as a human being. Instead of a slave or somebody who wasn't quite human, he was actually an intelligent human being. And that was a big mind shift at that time. And his letters, his speeches heavily influenced the civil rights leaders like Dr. King. Harriet Tubman, we referenced her earlier. She was very active as an escaped slave, helped people escape to freedom, but she was also, because of her experiences as a woman, as a black woman, she was also very active with the suffragette movement. And that was the movement for women to be allowed to vote. And very active with the laws, because even though eventually the laws were changed so black citizens could vote, there were so many laws prohibiting them and barriers to their voting. So the suffragette movement also was very active with gaining access to votes. And then the Quakers is a Christian group. They were a group that were very active from the very beginning in helping slaves escape. In fact, in the 1700s, George Washington himself, the first president of the United States, complained about the Quakers helping his slaves escape, stealing his property from him. The Quakers was a Christian organization, and they helped slaves and people, not just anybody in general, really, citizens, black, white, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, because we did have Jews and Muslims in the United States in this time period. They helped them become educated and provided paperwork and health care. The rails to freedom are the paths the slaves took to become free. They were most active in the Chesapeake Bay region. But what's interesting is if you notice all these states, there were some free states and free territories where there was no slavery. There were some slave states and territories where there was slavery. Then there were some unorganized places where there was no ruling. All of these states had different laws. So if a slave escaped into Philadelphia, into Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania would say, yep, you're a free person now. And if the owner were to come after them, say, nope, he's a free person now, he's in our state. If he went to Canada, Canada would say, nope, we don't have any laws of extradition, we're keeping him. But if he were to go to another state like New Jersey would say, yep, he's here. You can come get him and take him back, that's okay, but we're not going to return him. So many of the laws started shifting because so many states had different laws related to slavery and escaped slaves and the Underground Railroad, that the federal government itself needed to start establishing federal laws and enforcing federal laws with the returning of slaves. Freedom stations were spots along the way where people would stop and get help, part of the Underground Railroad. So can you imagine if Miss Julie was escaping from Delaware was a slave state, and she was escaping up into New York. What type of services would she need to escape? What would she need?
Food.
She would need food.
Map.
A map. Travel. What else do you think she would need? Healthcare, right? She would need healthcare with that along the way too. Rankin House was thought to have personally, this house in Ohio, personally helped over 30,000 slaves passed through here on their path to freedom, and that's in Ohio. The impact of the Underground Railroad is still felt today. These gentlemen were with the 1st Colored Brigade, which was, now we don't use that terminology, but at the time what it was they were black soldiers fighting for the Union. Many of them escaped through the Underground Railroad, and these soldiers were given soldier pensions, real jobs, real rations, real employment. The Underground Railroad eroded Southern control of property. So over a 40-year period between 1810 and 1850, it was thought that over 100,000 slaves escaped to the north. Now, if the average cost of a slave was about $35,000, what did that do to the Southern economy? How would it depress it? How much? How much?
30 billion? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot of zeros, right? Billions of dollars were lost through the Underground Railroad. That was a factor during the Civil War with being able to afford it, to fight it. We established new laws. What is considered personal property? What is not considered personal property? We established laws with other countries. Do we extradite somebody? Which means, do we go into that country? Does that country have to send that person back? How do we view income and assets? Are human beings income? They're slaves, they're property, they're worth value. They have paperwork written up about them, so they're a form of currency. Today, we're still feeling it. Over 27 million people are trafficked every year, and it generates about a $28 billion industry, the trafficking of people. But the same strategies that were used with the Underground Railroad pre-Civil War is currently being used today also with different laws. Helping people, we have stations to help people, we have laws, we have education, we have awareness of the problems. So the same strategies used in the past are currently being used also. Today we have the largest quantity of people who are enslaved, but it is also the smallest percentage of the population ever. And it's gradually getting even smaller. Here are my references. If you notice, they're in APA format. We have the Freedom Center Organization, Harriet Tubman biography, Pathways, this is Maryland and the Underground Railroad, and then PBS. PBS is Public Broadcast System. Do you have any questions? Yeah.
I suppose the race discrimination, it should be a global issue. So I don't think only black people fight for their freedom is enough to deal with issue.
Right.
So what do you think, since you mentioned there's still some discrimination to the race still exists in society, so what should we do to improve or to help to deal with this issue?
That's a good question. That's a tough question. It still does happen, and we're, like you said, we're still seeing repercussions from slavery with the racial problems that we have in the United States and the income inequity. One of the best ways we can fight the discrimination is just by honestly being aware that it does exist. It's not a pleasant subject. We don't like thinking about it, but we do need to be aware of it. We need to be aware that sometimes our actions or words, even if we don't intend to be harmful, sometimes they are harmful. But we can also speak up when we see other people being discriminated against. And we can help and support them, give a voice if they are not able to have a voice. And then many of you are going into business. Think about your business practices when you work with your corporations and you work with your companies, especially, if you have a voice in your company with the practices. How can you apply that? How can you ensure that the people who work for you have a living wage, realistically have a wage, and they have a choice? You have other questions? Okay, good. Next, Mr. Ken Cranker is going to come up and talk about the Transcontinental Railroad.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Now, as you saw, Leslie presented the Underground Railroad, which was a metaphoric railroad. The railroad I'm going to talk about is a real wood and iron railroad that also transformed American society. All right? So I've entitled this the Transcontinental Railroad, subtitle Linking the U.S. East to West. And you'll notice I have a source for the photos here. You always want to do that. Okay. So why do I want to present this? Well, first, because this Transcontinental Railroad was a major step toward changing the U.S. from a minor country, a small country that was on basically a third of the continent, to a major country, one that spanned the entire continent from east to west. Okay? As an overview, first I'll provide some background as to the historical period and things like that. Then I'll tell you about what was done with the railroad, and then I'll demonstrate some of the results of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So hop on board, I'll take you for a ride. So first, the background, as I said before the Transcontinental Railroad, the U.S. was mostly east of the Mississippi River, that is. All right. However, in 1849, gold was discovered in California, and as a result, there was a gold rush with people going from the East Coast to California, from people coming from all nations of the world to California seeking gold. And eventually, there were so many there that they wondered how they were going to govern themselves, and it turned out that they wanted to become a state, and they did become a state in 1850. But then there was the problem. We had the eastern United States, and then California. How could you connect the two? Well, it was very difficult, because they could either go all the way down, if you look at the map over there, all the way down around the tip of South America, which was long and costly. They could go halfway to Panama, cross Panama, and then go up. But that was very, very dangerous, because Panama was filled with mosquitoes that carried terrible diseases like yellow fever and malaria. And it was not uncommon for people to get sick going through Panama and then die when they got to California. Or they could go across the continent, which would take a very, very long time. It would take a couple years sometimes. Right? So it wasn't very convenient. Also, in the 1960s, the United States was in a civil war. The Civil War was related to the slavery issue, which was related to the Underground Railroad. Right? The U.S. was divided north and south. The north was non-slave, the south was slave. Right? But President Lincoln understood that the United States was also divided east and west. And they were fighting the war to unite the north and south. They needed to do something to unite the east and west. The country needed to be united. So, the task. The task was to build 1,600 miles of railroad from Omaha, Nebraska, which is pretty much near where the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers intersect. Okay? From Omaha, Nebraska to Sacramento, California. Now, I don't know if you know this, but Sacramento is the capital of California. Usually when I ask people, they say, Los Angeles? Sacramento is the capital, and because that's near where the gold was. All right? So they had to build this 1,600 miles of railroad track. And how they did it was by Congress actually passing a law, the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, that created two railroad companies. One was the Central Pacific, which started in California, in Sacramento, and built eastward. The other was the Union Pacific, which started in Omaha, Nebraska, and built westward. And the idea was that they would compete against each other, each one trying to build as quickly as possible, because the companies would be able to own the land around the railroad tracks. Right? So they thought with these companies competing, they would get the job done and get it done quickly, which they did. So, but how are they going to get the people to build the railroad? Because they were going through unpopulated areas. The only people in those areas were Indians who, basically were migratory. Well, turned out that from the company in California, the Central Pacific, they hired a lot of people from China. About 90% of the workers from the Central Pacific Railroad were Chinese. Well, what about on the Union Pacific side? Well, because the Civil War was being fought, after soldiers finished their time in the army, You know, these soldiers were used to a hard life. They were used to working hard. They were used to living with deprivation, and they were rough, strong men. They went and they went to build the railroad because they'd get paid very good money for it. So that's how they got the workers. But they had a lot of other issues that they had to deal with. The first was geography. Because there are mountain ranges, it's very difficult to make railroads through mountains. They had to blast holes, tunnels through mountains. They had to go across wide grasslands. And when I say grasslands, that means no trees, which means no wood. Okay? So they had some difficulties to overcome, but they managed to do it. They had to overcome nature too. Nature was quite unkind to the builders, especially in California, who were coming westward because it snowed on them more than they had ever experienced before. And they had to fight the snow while they were building. Of course, coming through the grasslands, they had to fight dryness. There wasn't much rain. How do they get water for people to drink? If people are working hard, they have to drink, right? Drink more water. All right? Yeah. And then there were issues with Indians, because the Indians didn't like the train going through the lands that they used, and there were problems there. But they did manage to overcome all those issues, and they finished building the railroad on May 10th, 1869, in a place called Promontory Point, Utah. And the interesting thing is that their strategy of having the two companies compete with each other worked. They finished ahead of schedule. These days, when people want to build something, do they usually finish ahead of schedule?
No.
No, it's almost always behind schedule. Those were the days. All right, yeah, here's a little picture of the celebration where the last rail was laid, and you can see the source there. And the results, you know, we definitely want to focus on the results of this, not just the fact that they built it. The United States was united. The second was that the country became smaller. Just as the globe has become smaller in a globalized world economy, you guys are studying here in the United States. 100 years ago, wouldn't have happened. Right? The people could move from New York to California. Before that, wouldn't have happened. Right? Also, Indian wars continued for a decade or more. Also, along the railroad, hellish towns sprung up. And we say hellish because the people who were out there were not the most educated, not the most ruly people. They tended to be very rough and tough and strong and drink a lot and do all sorts of things that cause trouble. Okay? But then these hellish towns eventually turned into more modern cities, which turned into states, which became the Western and Midwest United States. And finally, before the railroad, the Chinese were thought, well, you know, there was discrimination, a lot of discrimination. They were thought, I don't know, similar to blacks, kind of people. But seeing the work that the Chinese were able to do built respect for them. In fact, the Chinese workers were probably more efficient laborers than the people coming in the Union Pacific. So, just to summarize, the United States was united east to west, becoming complete, and society was transformed by this railroad. And here are my references. You'll see that I did use a Wikipedia reference. I went there for some information. However, I used 3 other references. All right? This one was a documentary video that I would certainly recommend. I found it fascinating. And this one is from the regents of the University of California. The regents are the people who make the tests for high school graduates. All right? And the virtual museum of the city of San Francisco. When driving the last bike, that's where I got the picture. Okay? So, do you have any questions?
Yes.
Yeah.
I wonder why government at the United States at that time gave such a big task to two companies.
Yeah, you mean why they didn't
Yeah, why
get
they give
more?
that? Also, you mentioned it published a law that
Yes.
the company if they build more railroads, they can own the land.
Yes.
And did that have any problems or
Yeah.
issue with that?
Yeah, actually it did.
Good question.
That's a wonderful question. That they created two companies, excuse me, because they wanted competition, but remember they were still fighting a war. And so they might not have had money to fund or to create more companies. Okay? Second, the second part of your question was what were some problems?
Yeah, where is this?
Well, in fact, because the companies wanted land, they actually built past each other. That they didn't agree on where to meet, and they built past each other. And when the government realized that, they said, no, we can't do this. Come and meet in Washington. We got to figure this out. And so they figured it out. So that was one issue. Yes, the companies were greedy. Yeah. Okay, good question. Yeah.
However, so the railroad is built after the Civil War, right?
Yes, it was finished. It was completed after the Civil War. It was
and-
started during.
And you said that the Union Pacific, the
Mhm.
company is hire the
War veterans, yeah.
war veterans, so if they're including some salary.
Some
Salary.
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 Yeah, they were paid. Yeah, the railroad paid good money. That's why people would come from China to work. They were paying good money. Yeah, and the people who had finished fighting, because when the soldiers were drafted to the war, they were drafted for a fixed period of time, and when they served their time, they could leave the army, and so they would go in and build the railroad.
And the army wasn't always able to pay the soldiers the way
Yes.
they wanted to,
Yes.
because they had no money, they were bankrupt themselves.
Yeah.
So these soldiers were able to work for the railroad and get a steady income.
But how about those Chinese? Like,
Yes.
After they built the railroad,
Mhm.
and where they go?
Yeah, some returned to China with a lot of money. Others stayed in the United States, and then there are the famous Chinatowns in California and San Francisco and those areas may have started there. Yeah, yeah.
I want to know why the most shortest way but cost the longest time.
Why the shorter way took
Uh,
the most time?
Yeah, cost longest time.
I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Like before build it, they work.
Why did it take so long to go across land?
Oh, why did it take so long?
Instead of all the way down
Yeah.
and
I
up
think
and
compare
around.
others, it's most shortest.
Oh,
Less
okay.
surprising for us.
Okay, well, because the boats go faster than people can
They
walk. Yeah, yeah. And especially because when people walk, they don't usually just, hey, I'm going for a walk, I'm gonna walk to California. No, they take their belongings, they take their children, they take their farm animals, and it's very slow going. Okay? Now, we do have one more thing for you here. And this is our little synthesis. All right? And we want to make sure that when you guys work together that you're able to synthesize yours as well. All right? So I'll start this off saying that looking at these two presentations, we can see that the Transcontinental Railroad was a real railroad, whereas the Underground Railroad was a virtual railroad, a metaphoric railroad. Also, the Transcontinental Railroad connected the East to gold, to the West and the resources and the people of California, whereas the Underground Railroad was connecting blacks to freedom. And I'm not sure if, I suspect this one might have been a better destination.
I think so.
All right? Leslie, go on.
Also, to connect back
What'd
to
you say?
that, getting gold, that's hard work. You have this concept of glorious gold everywhere. It's hard work digging out that gold. Not everybody was able to achieve it, just like the freedom. Achieving the freedom was very difficult, very painful, and not everybody was able to achieve the freedom. The Transcontinental Railroad incorporated Chinese workers, so they brought the Chinese workers over to build the railroads. And the Underground Railroad itself didn't draw people in, it was meant to release people. So they released the blacks into the freedom. But it also helped shift people's concepts, society's concepts. There's still a lot of ugly racism going on, discrimination, but now with the two railroads, society's views were more that the Chinese and the blacks were humans, not kind of human. The Transcontinental Railroad was started during the Civil War, and it ended after, whereas the Underground Railroad occurred before the Civil War. But it was named the Underground Railroad officially when railroads really started becoming popular and trains, the steam engines, started becoming popular. So there was that overlap between them.
Okay.
Do you guys notice any overlaps or any synthesis that we didn't mention?
Okay.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you very much for your attention and your questions.